Assalamu alaikum dear students. I welcome you to the lesson 17. We are going through the chapter number 4, sensation, attention and perception. And the topic which we are going to read today is Gestalt laws of perceptual organization. So let's begin. Before going into the detail of the Gestalt laws, first we will see what is Gestalt or what is Gestalt school of thought. Basically, Gestalt theory is a theory of perception which was developed by Max Wertheimer in 1910. Later on, Wolfgang Kohler and Kurt Kufka joined Max Wertheimer at the Frankfurt University, and they formally initiated a new school of thought in psychology named as Gestalt School of Thought. So, Gestalt theory or Gestalt school is a school of perception, is a theory of perception, that how we see the world, how we perceive the things around us, how we perceive the world. Starting from the word Gestalt, the word Gestalt is actually derived from a German word Gestalt, which means to place or put together. There is actually no exact equivalent in English language. Form is the usual translation. So, in psychology, the word Gestalt is often described as form, pattern, configuration, or shape. Okay? Gestalt means when parts identified individually have different characteristics to the whole. For example, whenever we see a certain object, we see that object as a whole, keeping inside its parts, but actually we describe it as a whole. For example, describing a tree, its parts are trunk, branches, leaves, and so on. But when we look at an entire tree, we are not consciously looking at the parts or consciously describing the parts. We are aware of the overall object, that is tree. In Gestalt school or in Gestalt psychology, parts are of secondary importance even though they can be clearly seen. Okay? So, Gestalt psychology proposed the idea that nothing is fully comprehensible out of context. Things give meaning in the context in which they are placed, in the context in which they exist. For example, a thing will be properly explained or described according to its context, according to its use, and according to its placement at that particular time. We say that whole is better than sum of its parts. In Gestalt school, we say that whole is better than sum of its parts, or we can say that whole is different from its parts. Gestalt is a school of thought which laid emphasis on studying things and factors as a whole. Gestalt psychologists explain the laws of perceptual organization. So these laws are referred to as Gestalt laws of perceptual organization. Now we are going to read the Gestalt laws of perception one by one in detail. First is the figure and ground. Okay. In perceptual process, we view figure in isolation from ground. When we are looking around and we are perceiving different things actively or passively, we are actually focusing on the figures as well as the backgrounds. The individual is influenced by a number of stimulus in the environment at the same time. All the things in the environment cannot be brought into the field of consciousness. We cannot be aware of everything present around us, but randomly, unconsciously or consciously, we are actually sensing those things and then perceiving those things. Some things become clearer because of the individual's interest or the properties of that stimulus, and some remain vague and unnoticed. The thing that is clear and conspicuous and it occupies an important position in the environment is actually known as figure. Figure is an important figure holds an important position in the environment. It is a clear object. It is a clear stimulus which gains our attention, or through or upon which we are attending, to, upon which we are uh, exerting our sensations, or in which we are exerting our concentration, and so on. What is ground? The things which are vague, indistinct, and unimportant are referred to as ground. Figure is of great importance because we are consciously aware of and attending to that thing. And when we are attending to the figure, its background is known as ground, which is a distinct and unimportant phenomenon. Okay. So, according to Gestalt law of figure and ground, we tend to pay attention and perceive things in the foreground first. A stimulus will be perceived as separate from its ground. So Gestalt laws say that we perceive things in the ground first. The things which are vague, indistinct, and unimportant recede into the background and are referred to as ground. Ground is the field of consciousness, whereas figure is the center of consciousness. Just as the focus of consciousness fluctuates, in the same way, various stimulus keep oscillating between figure and ground. We are not always concentrating on a figure. Sometimes or at a moment a thing can be our figure, and at the very next moment this figure becomes the ground, this becomes the foreground, and there will be another figure which we are attending. Okay, so we pay attention and perceive things in the foreground first. As you can see in this diagram, this is the figure part which is gaining our attention first, and then this is the background, this is the ground. The next Gestalt law of perceptual organization is proximity. Law of proximity says that elements that are closer together will be perceived as coherent, will be perceived as grouped. Okay, the elements or the objects which are near to each other tend to be grouped together. Similarly, we can say that the stimuli that are near to each other in the external environment and have common characteristics are actually formed into separate groups during the perceptual process. They are all perceived as belonging to one unit. For example, in this diagram, we see that because of this closeness, we perceive these 6 round shaped figures as a single group, as one group. This is one group and this is a second group. Because of this nearness, because of this similarity, because of this closeness, because of the same characteristics, we are grouping these together. Okay. The next perceptual law is similarity. Law of similarity says that elements that look similar will be perceived as part of the same form. There seems to be a triangle in the square. We link similar elements together. For example, looking at this picture, there is a triangle in the center of this square. Because of similarity, we are grouping this part, and so this part is identified as a separate one. When stimuli in the external environment are grouped together on the basis of similarity, this is the law of similarity, as clear from this diagram. Another perceptual law of organization is law of good form. The Gestalt law of good form describes the tendency of a person to perceive forms of similar shape, form, color, pattern, and other attributes in a group. According to this principle, we can coherently organize stimulus in the environment on the basis of our abilities. We conceive a good shape on the basis of characteristics of a stimulus so that we have clear perception of it. This is known as principle of good form. This principle explains why people are able to differentiate varying groups of shapes and patterns. We conceive a good shape on the basis of characteristics of stimulus so that we have clear perception. Law of good form is also known as law of good pragnanz. According to this law, the stimulus will be organized into as good as figure as possible. In this example, good refers to the symmetry, simplicity, and regularity. The figure is perceived as a square overlapping a triangle, not a combination of several complicated shapes. Okay? Based on our experiences with perception, we expect certain patterns and therefore perceive that expected pattern. Because we are already aware of these shapes, we are already aware of what is triangle and what is square. So whenever there is a stimulus like this, traces, we already have images, schemas, and traces of those objects in our mind, and we will describe this or we will perceive this image as a square and a triangle overlapping. Okay, so law of good form or law of good pragnanz says that we coherently organize the stimulus in the environment on the basis of our ability, on the basis of our memory. We tend to organize those stimulus. We tend to organize those stimulus in a simple, convenient form, convenient way so that there is no difficulty in describing that shape. Okay. The next Gestalt law of perceptual organization is good continuation. The law of good continuation says that individuals have the tendency to continue contours whenever the elements of the pattern establish an implied direction. In this image, the top branch is seen as continuing the first segment of the line. This allows us to see things as flowing smoothly without breaking lines into the multiple parts. Whenever we see the images or stimulus in this way, our brain automatically perceives it in a form of continuity, in a form of wave, in a form of smooth path. And the law according to which the individual organizes figures with similar nature and direction into ground and figure is the law of good continuation. Generally, we perceive continuous things as a form. Okay. The next law of perceptual organization is closure. Law of closure says that we tend to fill the gaps or close the figures we perceive. We enclose a shape by completing a contour and ignoring gaps in the figure. For example, in this image, we tend to ignore the gaps and complete the contour lines. There are no triangles or circles, but our mind is capable of perceiving it as a circle and a triangle by filling the contours automatically, by perceiving it as a whole circle. Our minds fill the missing information to create familiar shapes and images. Okay? This is the perceptual quality of mind, that it creates familiar shapes and images. This is law of closure. We can say that according to this law, a bit incomplete object or figure can be perceived as complete because of the brain tendency to perceive things as a whole. The individual himself fills in the gaps at the sight of an incomplete square or circle. Okay? The next Gestalt law of perceptual organization is law of common fate. Law of common fate is the Gestalt grouping law that states that the elements which are moving together tend to be perceived as a unified group. Okay? For example, think of watching a flock of geese moving across a sky. The geese are all flying the same direction at approximately the same speed. We can see this in this diagram. When a few stimulus are moving together in the same direction, they are perceived as a group. Okay? We can also take the example of common fate as when children adopt different styles when they are doing physical exercise. Similarly, the people who are dancing are viewed as separate group in perception. Okay? Law of common fate. When few stimulus are moving together in the same direction, they are perceived as a group. The next law is law of context. According to this, context or location also affects perception. Sometimes the same things do not appear the same because of the context. If in the figure, you can see when we look from left to right, the last picture of the first and second rows do not appear to us the same. Okay? Simply because of the context. After looking at the faces, we tend to see a face, whereas after have seen the animals, the same figure looks like a mouse. The thing do not give meaning out of their context. Context or location affects our perception. These both rows do not appear the same. The next law of Gestalt perceptual organization is the frame of reference. Perception naturally contains references of our internal and external relations. Every individual looks at a thing from his own point of view. For example, a student, a laborer, or any high ranking officer and a consumer may view a thing from their own specific angle. This is known as frame of reference. Even if three different students have obtained the same marks, their reactions will be different. A brilliant and a dull student react differently to the results. Okay? The students who often come first feel sad at getting the second position, while we see that the student who obtains a pass with grace marks feels satisfied that he has not had a fail in that subject. So, frame of reference. This was the other, according to our topic, our lecture. This was the last Gestalt law of perceptual organization. These Gestalt laws actually help us to perceive the things around us because at the same time we are being bombarded by so many sensations from different sense organs. If brain do not have the capacity of perceptual organization, or if we are unable to perceive the world according to the Gestalt laws, the world would be a haphazard place because of so many sensations being bombarded at the same time. So Gestalt laws help us in viewing the world or in viewing the environment around us in a smooth way. Okay? We can smoothly observe things according to the Gestalt law of figure and ground by keeping in view that this is the figure and this is the ground, by the law of proximity, nearness, by the law of similarity, by good shape, by continuation, closure. Brain has the capacity of filling in the gaps. So, Gestalt laws are helpful in the perception of the world around us. The founder of Gestalt school of thought, Max Wertheimer, um along with Wolfgang Kohler and Kufka, they experimented in University of Frankfurt. Different phenomena of Gestalt like isomorphism, pi phenomena, different laws of insight were given by these people. So Gestalt theory is a theory of perception, and this theory is a very comprehensive and important theory because this school of thought helps us in perceiving the world around us in a smoother, simpler way. This was today's lecture. I hope the topic is clear. We will be coming with the next lecture inshallah. Till then, take care. Allah Hafiz. Thank you.